I didn't arrive at that church soup kitchen to be judged. I arrived because it was open, because the lights stayed on late enough for a man like me to find a warm place and keep moving, because the coffee pot got refilled without asking questions, because the rules were simple. Wash your hands, follow directions, and don't make trouble. Marcus Reed wasn't a name people said with respect at first. It was more like a label they tossed across the room, like they were testing whether it stuck. I was 50-something then, or maybe I looked older. Age does things to you when you carry the wrong memories. My hair had gone gray around the edges, and my hands didn't look like they belonged anywhere soft. They looked like they'd spent years doing what they had to do. I had no uniform, no medals pinned on my chest, no handshake that lasted longer than it should have. All I had was a worn canvas bag and the habit of standing just slightly apart from the crowd, scanning without thinking. That church sat on a street where storefronts changed every few years, but the need stayed the same. In the mornings, you could smell frying onions from the diner down the block, and in the afternoons, the air carried diesel and wet concrete after storms. The soup kitchen itself was in the basement. Cinder block walls painted the color of old eggshell, fluorescent lights humming above folding tables. I'd been there before, a few months earlier, when I first drifted into town with whatever was left in my truck and the last idea I hadn't given up on yet. The first time, people watched me like I was a problem they'd have to solve later. Ruth saw me then, Ruth in the hairnet and the worn cardigan, the kind of woman who looked like she'd prayed long enough to earn patience. She ran the place without being loud about it. She didn't manage, not the way people like to imagine it. She just moved through the room the way a good conductor moves through a band, steady, quiet, and certain. The second time she recognized my face. "Marcus," she said, not unkind, just factual, like we were matching a name to a file. When she handed me a pair of gloves and pointed at the dish station, it felt like being allowed to exist. But the other volunteers, young men and women with bright sneakers and donation tote bags, people who'd driven in after work or gotten dropped off by someone's sister, still looked at me like I might steal a ladle. There's a specific kind of contempt you can feel. It isn't loud. It doesn't have to be. It comes through in the way someone keeps a step between you and their food. In the way they say, "We already got it," and then set a pot down a little farther away like you can't be trusted with heat. On my second week, Caleb came in. Caleb was the newest volunteer, or at least that's what people said when they thought I couldn't hear. He had that fresh volunteer energy, too much caffeine, too much confidence in being useful. He was about my age, maybe a little younger. He carried himself like someone used to being told he was doing good. When Ruth asked him to check on supplies, he moved with purpose. Then he saw me. It wasn't that he was openly hostile. It was worse sometimes. He was casual, like it was normal to underestimate someone. "Hey," he said to me on the way to the side room where extra napkins were stored. You're the guy, right?" I kept my hands busy. I was wiping a counter with the kind of cloth that didn't stop being useful just because you were tired. "Just helping," I said. Caleb's smile was thin. "Yeah, we know. Ruth said you've been around a bit." "Been around," I repeated, because that's what people called you when they didn't know the rest. Caleb leaned against the counter like he had time to waste. "Most folks like you don't stick. Then somebody else has to redo your mess. You know how it goes." I looked at him then, not in a threatening way, just in the way you look when you're deciding whether a man is dangerous. Caleb didn't flinch, but the air between us changed. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain myself. I didn't ask him to understand. There are moments when you can win an argument and lose the day. I'd learned the hard way that dignity isn't always something you claim aloud. Sometimes it's something you keep. So I just nodded once and went back to the dish station. I worked through lunch rush like it was a routine. I stacked bowls where they wouldn't tip. I moved the serving ladles the way I'd moved tools when speed mattered and the cost of a mistake was measured in more than bruised pride. The kitchen filled up in waves. People came in with tired eyes and winter coats or summer sweat or a rain jacket that had been worn too long. Children ran between chairs, not because they were careless, but because they couldn't afford to be afraid. Ruth guided people with her voice and hands, like she'd done the same thing so often it had become a prayer in motion. I didn't talk much. I didn't collect stories. I didn't ask for sympathy. In my line of work, before the work stopped and everything else started falling apart, silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. That day, the room was busy enough that people didn't have time to think about who I was. Soup and bread, hot coffee, folding chairs scraping the tile. Ruth called out for extra help. Caleb went to refill cups. I stood near the warming station where the last pots sat waiting like they were patient. Then I heard it. Not yelling, not screaming, not the kind of chaos people expect. It was a different sound, like someone's voice got caught between effort and panic. A man at the far table tried to reach for his water and couldn't. His chair bumped the edge of the table, and for a second he looked confused, like his own body had betrayed him. People noticed him the way people notice trouble when it stops being abstract. Hey, you okay?" someone asked. The man's eyes went wide, then unfocused. His mouth opened and nothing came out. Ruth was already moving. "Get me the first aid kit," she said. Caleb was halfway across the room, and I watched him pause like he was waiting for someone else to tell him what to do. That pause was the thing that bothered me. Not because it was his fault, but because time in a medical emergency doesn't negotiate. The man slumped toward the floor. His breath sounded thin. I stepped forward before anyone had time to decide I was allowed. "Clear the space," I said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. People turned their heads because my tone cut through the room with a kind of certainty. One woman tried to hold her hands out like she could help but didn't know how. "Back," I said gently, and she did. Ruth knelt instantly. "We've got it," she told the room, like the word "we" could organize panic. Caleb finally arrived with the first aid kit, panting like he'd jogged for the chance to be useful. He stared at the man on the floor. What do we do?" I didn't tell Caleb to stop being nervous. I didn't tell him he was doing it wrong. I just acted. "Hands," I said, and I pointed, small, specific, at what needed to be moved away. I checked the man's face. I watched his eyes. I felt for a pulse where I was taught to look first. There's a kind of calm that comes from having once seen worse. Not the calm of being fearless, the calm of knowing what fear costs. Ruth looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something shift from skepticism to urgency. "Marcus," she said, have you done this before?" Before I could answer, Caleb blurted, "He's ex-military, right?" He said it like he was testing whether it was a real rumor. I didn't respond. That's the thing about a record. It doesn't care what strangers guess. It speaks when it matters. The man's lips were pale. His breathing was irregular, and his skin had a sheen like he was sweating through something deeper than heat. I took the pulse again. "Call 911, I said, and my voice stayed steady even when I could feel everyone else's attention harden. Caleb's phone appeared in his hand, and he looked down at it as if it had grown there by accident. "Right. Yeah, dialing," he said quickly. While Caleb spoke to the dispatcher, stumbling over details, then catching himself, Ruth held the man's head in a careful way. "Stay with me," she murmured. Her voice wasn't dramatic. It was kind in the way a rope is kind when you pull someone out of water. I opened the kit. Gloves, alcohol wipe, tape. I didn't ask Ruth for permission. I didn't ask Caleb for permission. I just did what needed doing. The man's wrist twitched. A small tremor ran through his body. I kept my eyes on him. "Easy," I said, not to the man, but to everyone around him, because panic makes people clumsy. One teenager stood too close, staring like it was a movie. I moved him back without raising my voice. "Give space," I said. The teenager blinked, embarrassed, then stepped away. The seconds piled up. When you've been in enough situations where every second costs someone something, you measure time without thinking. I listened for the dispatcher's update through Caleb's half-turned body. I caught fragments. Address, basement entrance, adult, sudden collapse. Ruth shifted, and I could tell she was trying to keep the man comfortable while watching his breathing like it might change direction at any moment. I checked his airway. His tongue had started to fall back. I adjusted his position carefully. It wasn't a grand move. It was just correct. When he coughed, a small wave of relief went through the room. Then his eyes rolled again, and that relief tightened into fear. "Vitals?" Ruth asked me. I gave her what she needed. Breathing irregular, pulse weak but present. She nodded as if those words meant something solid. Caleb stepped closer with the kind of guilt that shows up after you've waited too long. Sorry, he said. I didn't let him turn it into a conversation. "Don't apologize," I replied. "Focus." He swallowed. "Okay." When the first responders arrived, boots on tile, voices in the hallway, everything changed again. The paramedics asked questions quickly. Ruth answered the best she could, her voice steady now that she'd turned fear into information. Caleb stood slightly to the side, hands clenched, watching like he finally understood he might have been wrong about me. I could feel it in the way their eyes kept flicking to my hands. They were searching my posture for the kind of competence that doesn't happen by luck. The paramedic leader, a woman with a tight bun and a radio clipped to her vest, looked at the man on the floor, then at me. "Who told you what to do?" she asked. I didn't brag. I didn't say me like I was collecting points. I just said, "You got here fast." The paramedic didn't smile, but I saw respect flicker behind her expression. They worked with urgency. Oxygen, lines, a monitor, a firm rhythm of tasks that turned chaos into procedure. When the monitor stabilized, the room exhaled like a held breath finally got released. The man, he wasn't fully awake, but he was breathing better, was loaded onto the stretcher. As they moved him out, Ruth stayed behind for a moment to straighten a chair nobody had bothered to notice earlier. I didn't touch her. I didn't try to take control of the aftermath. Ruth walked toward me after the ambulance left. Her face looked different now. Not because she'd suddenly become a different person, but because she'd watched something happen that didn't fit the version of me she'd assumed. "Marcus," she said again, but this time it wasn't a label. It was an acknowledgement. "You don't talk," she said quietly. I kept my hands busy with gloves I was already peeling off. "What do you mean?" I asked, though my voice didn't hold confusion. It held restraint. Ruth took a step closer. "You don't talk. You just do. You didn't ask who you were allowed to help. You didn't wait for permission." Caleb hovered behind her like he was unsure whether he should speak. He did. "I thought," he began. I didn't turn my head. Ruth finished for him gently, saving him the humiliation of confessing too much. "He knows his way around a crisis." My throat tightened. Not from emotion exactly. From the weight of being seen when you've been trying not to beg for it. I didn't want gratitude. I didn't need it. A day like that didn't require praise. It required competence and calm, and then it required space for everyone to get back to their lives. Ruth's gaze went past me to the doorway, then back. "There's a man down the hall," she said. "The dispatcher asked for his emergency contact info when they picked him up. Someone left it here. Paper slip fell out of his coat." My stomach tightened at the word coat, at the idea of papers and names. "I can get it," I said. I walked down the narrow hall and found the slip of paper near the coat rack where donations hung. It wasn't folded neatly. It was the kind of slip you tuck into your pocket when you don't trust your memory. Ruth was right behind me. Caleb followed like he was trying to be useful again. The man, our man, had written down a phone number. But beneath it, he'd written a name. Not the man's name, a different name, a unit designation, a date, and then something that made my hands go cold. A familiar reference number, the kind you remember even when you've tried not to. I stared at the paper for a moment longer than I should have, and I felt Ruth watching me. "Marcus?" she asked. I didn't answer. Not with words. Not yet. Instead, I returned the slip to Ruth's open palm like it was heavier than paper. She read it, eyes scanning, then her mouth parted slightly. "Is that," she started. Caleb leaned forward, and his expression changed from curiosity to surprise to confusion. Ruth looked at me properly then, the way you look at someone when you realize you've been wrong for a long time. "That's an honorable discharge reference," she said slowly. A quiet settled over the hall. I could hear the hum of the church lights, the distant scrape of a chair someone had moved earlier. In my head, images flickered, not the kind you share, not the kind you brag about, the kind you carry. Ruth swallowed. Marcus Reed. I waited for her to say the rest. Caleb couldn't help himself. "Your name is on that?" I finally looked at him. There are a lot of ways people recognize you. Some look like admiration, some look like guilt. Caleb looked like he needed the world to make sense again. I didn't give him that. I didn't explain, I didn't correct, I just said, "He'll be okay." Ruth's eyes softened in a way that hurt. "How do you know?" she asked. I didn't answer, because how implied a story, and I'd already learned that stories become weapons in the hands of people who want to use them. I wasn't here to win something, I was here to serve. The next hours moved like they were supposed to. People came back to the tables because need doesn't stop just because a crisis happened. Ruth sent volunteers back to work. She kept an extra eye on me, but it wasn't the suspicious watch from earlier. It was careful respect. Caleb stayed near the supply shelves the whole time, quietly doing what was asked. He didn't make jokes anymore. He didn't talk about drifters like that word belonged to me. At some point near mid-afternoon, Ruth walked me to the front desk area where the church kept records for donations and volunteer schedules. There was a folder there, old paper and stamped forms. She set it on the counter, then looked at me as if she knew I would refuse to take the shortcut. "Someone asked about you," she said. I stared at the folder but didn't touch it. "People ask," I said. Ruth nodded. "Not like casual talk, like they're trying to connect dots." My jaw tightened. She didn't push. That was Ruth's strength. She didn't shove dignity into someone's face. She opened the folder herself and pulled out a letter. It had been mailed to the church months earlier. Ruth had never opened it, not fully. She'd set it with the other paperwork and moved on. But now she brought it to me like she was handing me something fragile. I read the first lines and felt my chest go tight. The letter was from a veteran services organization. It was addressed to the church because a local contact had asked them to reach out. It wasn't asking for publicity. It wasn't advertising. It was informational. It said my name. It said something about a medical incident that had occurred before I stopped showing up anywhere. It referenced a service record. And then it mentioned an order. Not an order like, "do this." An order like the chain of command that still existed in paperwork even after you've tried to disappear from the world. Ruth didn't read it out loud. She just stared at me while I read. Finally, I looked up. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. My voice didn't accuse, it asked. Ruth gave a small, careful shrug. "Because it didn't matter," she said. "Not to the people we serve, and not to you." I turned the letter over. There was a detail written in handwriting near the bottom. Someone had made a note, a line that wasn't about medals or rank. It was about a specific date and a specific situation. About how I'd once handled a medical crisis under pressure and then disappeared afterward. About how the man who got saved had never forgotten. I remembered that man, not with gratitude, with accuracy. The memory came with the same restraint as the letter. No drama, no pleading, just the truth of what had happened. Ruth's voice was quiet. "He was the one who said you might be here." Caleb had walked closer without being invited, and now he stood at the doorway between the hall and the office. He didn't speak, but his eyes were fixed on mine like he was finally catching up. Ruth closed the letter gently. "Marcus," she said, "I'm not asking you to explain yourself." Then she paused. "But people are going to keep guessing. If you don't want that, we can keep it simple. You can keep coming here, you can keep helping, and I'll make sure they stop looking at you like you're trouble." I wanted to tell her not to, not because I didn't want respect, because respect, like sympathy, can become a trap. I'd seen men get treated like icons, then abandoned when the story ran out. I didn't want to be worshipped. I wanted to be allowed to do my job. So I nodded once. "That's enough," I said. Ruth smiled. Not bright, but real. "That's all I need." The next week, something changed in the room. Not dramatically, not like a movie. The fluorescent lights didn't glow brighter. People didn't suddenly sing hymns, but the way volunteers stood shifted. They moved closer when Ruth asked without hesitation. They asked me for help when the kitchen needed muscle. Caleb. Caleb apologized once more, not to win forgiveness, but because he looked genuinely sick about how wrong he'd been. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not because I want you to like me, because I didn't know." I nodded. I didn't tell him he had been cruel. I didn't tell him he'd been unsafe. I just let the apology land where it belonged. The man who'd collapsed after spending days in the hospital came back. Not for applause, for coffee. He walked into the church basement on a crutch, his face lighter than it had been in the emergency. Ruth guided him to a chair. He wore a clean jacket that looked like it had been chosen carefully. When he saw me, his shoulders lifted like he'd been holding himself together with memory. He didn't say much at first. He just looked at my hands. Then he held out his own hand. Not a dramatic handshake, a steady one. "Thank you," he said. That word sat between us. I didn't feel comfortable with it, not because I didn't mean it, because "thank you" can turn into "tell me your story." And I had no interest in feeding the curiosity that turns pain into entertainment. So I returned the handshake firmly and said, "You were worth trying." He nodded, eyes glistening but not spilling. Ruth stood by, watching with the kind of quiet dignity that doesn't need an audience. Caleb stood behind her, attentive, his expression careful. Then the man on the crutch reached into his pocket and pulled out another slip of paper. He handed it to Ruth. Ruth read it, then looked at me. "He wrote this for you," she said. I took the paper. It was a letter, brief. Not a confession, not a biography. Just one promise, that he would keep my name out of other people's mouths unless I chose it. That he wouldn't let my service become gossip. Ruth spoke softly. "He's careful, like you." I stared at the letter. I folded it once and slipped it into my pocket. No speeches, no explanations. My life had never been built on being understood. It had been built on being useful. But that day, weeks after the emergency, the room looked at me differently. Not like a hero, like a man. Like someone who had earned the right to be there. That was the difference. And when people asked me questions anyway, where I'd served, why I came here, what happened that made me drift, I didn't feed it. I kept serving soup, kept washing dishes, kept moving the serving spoons without spilling. Quiet dignity is its own kind of revenge, because it tells people the truth without letting them own it. It tells them, "You underestimated me, but you can't measure what matters by rumor." Months passed. The soup kitchen became familiar again, like a rhythm. Ruth greeted me by name without flinching. Caleb, still there, checked on the new volunteers and corrected their assumptions. He'd learned to watch his tone. He'd learned that confidence without compassion is just noise. One morning in late winter, the church held a small volunteer meeting upstairs. Ruth asked me to sit in the front row. I didn't refuse. I never refused a request that sounded like it was for everyone. The room was warm. The coffee smelled burnt in the way old machines always smell. People talked about fundraising, staffing, and how to keep the soup kitchen organized. Then Ruth stood up and cleared her throat. She didn't announce my past. She didn't use my story as a sermon. She didn't play with people's emotions like they were props. She just said, "We have people here who help because they know what a body needs when it's in trouble." Then she looked around the room. If you don't know someone's background, don't decide who they are. Let their work speak. That's all. There were a few murmurs. Nobody pointed at me. Nobody needed to. In that moment, the room's eyes found me the way light finds a corner. It wasn't dramatic, it was automatic. I could feel the old contempt fading in real time. Not because people had suddenly become saints, because truth had entered the room, and truth doesn't negotiate. After the meeting, Caleb came up to me. He stood awkwardly for a second, then spoke with the humility he'd had to learn the hard way. "I won't assume anymore," he said. "But do you ever think about leaving?" He meant leaving the church, or maybe leaving the past behind. He didn't phrase it like a debate. He phrased it like he genuinely wanted to know. I looked out the small window at the parking lot and the pale sky. I thought about the way the emergency had happened, how quickly everything could turn into helplessness, how restraint was the only thing that kept you from turning into the problem. "No," I said finally. That was my answer. Because the question wasn't really about distance. It was about whether I still had purpose. And purpose is not something you lose on one bad day. Sometimes it just goes quiet until someone needs you again. Later that week, I saw the man from the emergency, our man, in the entryway. He was steady on his crutch now, no longer in the fragile phase. He recognized me instantly. His face warmed. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. Then he glanced toward a younger volunteer who was about to fall into the same habit of judging. He smiled sadly. "Your record did the talking," he said. I nodded once. I didn't correct him, because the record wasn't just paperwork. It was what I'd done without needing applause. It was the way I'd moved in a crisis while everyone else froze. It was the way I'd refused to make the emergency about me afterward. That's why the room had finally listened. That's why Ruth had shifted from caution to trust. That's why Caleb had changed his posture. Not because I had demanded respect, because I had earned it through restraint. The church kept running. The soup kept being ladled. The coffee kept getting poured. And I kept showing up. Not as a story, as a service. When people asked about me months later, when rumors tried to find me again, I didn't chase them. I didn't argue. I didn't try to correct every wrong assumption. I just kept doing the work. Because a man who has nothing left to prove understands something simple. Dignity doesn't have to be loud to be real. And the day I handled that medical emergency, the room learned the truth without my permission. They didn't just see that I could help. They saw that I had chosen not to make myself the center of attention. That choice, quiet, consistent, was the real redemption. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition. And it stayed in the basement like the smell of warm bread, stubborn, comforting, and impossible to ignore.